Hi, folks. My name is Cam. I am the co host of the Pro Life Guys podcast, a podcast dedicated to equipping you with the tools that you need to have compassionate and compelling conversations about abortion. And this is a training workshop on how you can have those mind changing and life saving conversations about abortion with your friends, with your family members, with random strangers, members of your community. All right. And so, as pro life advocates, our goal is to help people accept the pro-life worldview, accept a worldview that says all humans should get human rights, and human rights must begin when a human's life begins. Our goal is to draw people towards this position so they reject abortion in all circumstances that may surround a pregnancy and at all stages of development. How do we do that? Well, as pro lifers, we want the conversation to pivot around the humanity of the preborn. As well known speaker Stephanie Gray Connors often talks about, if the preborn are not living members of the human species, then abortion isn't nearly the human rights violation that we suggest that it is. However, if abortion does directly and intentionally end the life of an innocent human being, then it is happening at a crazy level in Canada, around 100,000 times every year. We are killing the weakest and most vulnerable members of the human family. And so this is where we want to focus the conversation. And yet, as we often see in conversation, the majority of people that we speak to who support abortion do so because they focus on the hard circumstances that mothers and fathers are often faced with during their pregnancies. And so, what we often need to do to start is we need to bridge the gap. We need to meet people where they're at and draw them towards a conversation about the humanity of the preborn rather than starting at that point. And this three-step process often draws people towards that acceptance. And yet, at times, we may also need to talk about the personhood of preborn children. If somebody were to accept that, sure, they're a living member of the human species, but they're not valuable human beings like you and I. There's a difference between being a Homo sapien and being a valuable person. And also, at times, we may need to do what we call heart apologetics, talking with people through the very difficult circumstances that they may have lived through or somebody close to them may have experienced, helping them navigate the emotional baggage that has come through those experiences. And so this is the roadmap for the conversations that we want to have about abortion. So let's dive into it. Let's dive into how we have these conversations in a productive way, because I'm confident whether you've never had a conversation with somebody before about abortion, or whether you've had dozens or even hundreds of conversations about abortion before, this roadmap can help your conversation become not only more streamlined, but Lord willing, more compassionate and more compelling to actually draw people towards a complete rejection of abortion in all circumstances and at all stages of development. So let's dive into it. When we talk about bridging the gap, what do we mean? As I mentioned, we talk about the idea that often we have to go out and meet people where they're at. If they're starting from a perspective of mothers are faced with incredible suffering, if that's where they're starting and we're talking about the humanity of the preborn, then we're going to pass each other like ships in the night if we don't actually connect. And we as pro-lifers have the incentive to try to connect because lives hang in the balance. And so we need to meet people where they're at. And we're going to use three tools that are effective and valuable in all sorts of different conversations, whether they're about abortion, whether about politics or religion, or even about where you and your spouse are going to go for dinner on Friday night. These tools can help you convert what could be an argument, a me versus you, winner versus loser situation, into a productive conversation where both people are working towards a common end goal. And those three tools are what we call common ground, analogies, and questions. And I want to give you a moment to write down why you think common ground would be a valuable aspect to having productive conversations about anything, not just about the abortion issue. Often, what we find the value of common ground is that it generates some degree of rapport and camaraderie between people having this conversation. It connects people on a level, helping them realize that they are both concerned about the matter at hand, that we both recognize that there's a problem. When it comes to the abortion situation, by building common ground, by empathizing with the suffering that mothers and fathers can be faced with during pregnancy and raising children, we can connect with the very real idea that pregnancy can be really hard, that situations can be absolutely horrendous. There are problems in our society that demand solutions. Common ground helps us to connect on a human level, turning it from a me versus you into a we together are solving a problem in a way that will be the best possible solution. Okay, so that's common ground. Why do you think analogies would be valuable in having conversations about abortion? The way I think about it is this: how often do we interact with preborn children, human embryos, and fetuses? Not very often, right? And because of that, it can be really difficult to connect with them on a meaningful level. What we want to do is we want to use a concept, a vehicle that people are very familiar with to identify a principle that they may not be familiar with. What I mean by that is, for example, I have a background in genetics and I spend a lot of time studying DNA replication. If you don't know very much about DNA replication, and if I were to just start spouting off the different proteins and cofactors and genetic components involved in DNA replication, that might go right over your head and you might not understand anything that I'm saying. However, if I make an analogy, if I say that DNA replication is a little bit like unzipping a zipper, pressing a piece of Play Doh against that zipper and making a new zipper based off of the mold that you've just created in the Play Doh, that's going to resonate a lot more. Using a concept like zippers and Play Doh that you're very familiar with to generate a principle that you are otherwise unfamiliar with. That's what we want to do in abortion conversations as well. We want to talk about principles like killing born children, trotting out the toddler is something that we're going to do time and time again to demonstrate that we're never willing to kill born children to solve problems. No matter how terrible the problem is that a mother or father may be faced with, we're never willing to kill a born child. And if we're not willing to kill born children, why are we willing to kill preborn children? That last one leads me into that third tool that we want to use time and again, and that's questions. I want you to take a moment to think and maybe even write down why you think questions would be valuable in conversations about abortion and even other topics that might have a tinge of confrontation aligned with them. Now, obviously, there's a lot of reasons why questions can be valuable. Not only do they help us understand where people are coming from, not only does it help us not make assumptions about their worldview, it allows us to genuinely understand where they're coming from. Not only that, but it also allows us to lead them towards a productive conversation, right? It allows us to lead them towards points and principles that they may not have thought of before, but that they're coming to their own conclusion on. And the reason I mention that is because who do we trust more naturally than anyone else in the world? As much as we might say that we want to trust our parents, we might want to trust our priests and pastors, for many of us, we trust ourselves more than anyone else around, not just because we're proud, conceited people, but often because we know how we got to a particular conclusion. If you and I do a math equation, we come to different answers. Unless I have a very high degree of confidence that you are a math whiz, I'm probably going to stick with my answer until I'm proven wrong because I know how I got to my answer. Same thing goes on moral questions like abortion. If we're simply stating facts about abortion, about preborn children, it's very likely that they're simply going to brush off the person that we're talking to, brush off their back like water off a duck's back because they don't see how we came to those conclusions. Whereas if we ask questions, then it causes them to think about it for themselves and they come to their own conclusions and they understand how they got there. We're going to ask a lot of questions through this workshop and through your conversations. You're going to have a lot more success and be much more productive by asking questions rather than by simply stating information. And so let's apply this to conversations about abortion. As we can probably all relate, We want to talk about the central issue, humanity of the preborn. And as I've mentioned, many people want to talk about these circumstances around the abortion issue. Hard circumstances, very real circumstances that people in Canada, people around the world are faced with on a daily basis. And pro-lifers often make one of two mistakes when confronted with these hard situations. The first mistake that we make that we don't want to do is we try to refute the scenario. If somebody were to say to us, I think abortion should be allowed in cases of sexual assault, sometimes pro-lifers are tempted to say sexual assault accounts for less than 1% of abortions performed in North America. Therefore, we shouldn't even talk about it. It happens so rarely. Not only does that beg the question, how often do people actually report that they're victims of sexual assault when they're having abortions? But even if it were true that only 1% of abortions are performed on mothers who are victims of sexual assault, it would completely nullify their lived experience. And if you're talking to somebody who has been through that scenario, as I have on countless occasions, or know somebody who's been through that, that can be incredibly condescending and incredibly off-putting. We don't want to refute. But we also don't want to go too far in the other end of the spectrum either. We don't want to try to resolve every circumstance that people are faced with. Sure, pro-lifers should be working hard to resolve many of problems in our society, but we shouldn't be leading with that. And what I mean by that is that if somebody were to say, I think abortion should be allowed when mothers are living in poverty, pro-lifers are tempted to say, no, we're going to help out. We're going to provide everything that they need. And in many communities across Canada, that might be manageable. That might be possible. And yet, what happens if that mother's living in a community where there isn't that support available? What if they're living in a nation where that support is not available? Or what if pro-lifers are simply not very good at connecting them with the support that they need? Does that make abortion okay? The fact that pro-lifers often fail in their attempts to solve all of the world's problems doesn't justify abortion. Abortion is wrong not because pro-lifers are willing to help, but because abortion directly and intentionally kills a human. And so how do we navigate these if we're not going to refute or resolve? We're going to walk through those three steps that we just talked about: common ground, analogy, and question. So let's apply it to a circumstance that we hear on street corners and on doorsteps day after day. Abortion should be allowed when a mother is living in poverty. Imagine a mother who is living in poverty. She doesn't even know how she's going to put food on her own plate, let alone on the plate of another child. She's not able to make rent. Maybe she's even living on the street. Should we compel that mother to carry through with her pregnancy and deliver that child? What we want to do is we want to start by building common ground, saying something along the lines of I agree with you that that would be incredibly difficult. I can't even imagine what it would be like to live in such a very dire and day by day situation, not knowing where your next meal is going to come from. I agree that that would be incredibly difficult. Next, we want to build the analogy. And we want to do that by asking a question along these lines. Imagine that a mother with a 2-year-old child was living in a stable situation, but tragically, her spouse left her, left home, didn't leave her with any money or anything like that, and she lost her job very shortly thereafter. Now, she is spiraling towards a similar scenario. She's spiraling towards not being able to pay rent, not being able to buy groceries. Would we ever suggest that mother be allowed to kill her 2-year-old child to cope with her deteriorating financial situation? No. The vast majority of people that you're going to talk to are going to agree that no, you can't kill a 2-year-old if a mother is living in poverty. And so we ask that pivot question that brings us back to the humanity of the preborn. We ask, if we're not willing to kill a born child when they and their mother are living in poverty, why are we willing to kill a preborn child? What is the difference? That draws us back to that central issue of the humanity of the preborn, because if this were truly about poverty, we'd be willing to kill anyone, born or preborn, to cope with this hard circumstance. And though what they have demonstrated through their responses is simply that they do not value born humans in the same way that they value preborn humans. And so let's talk about that. That's the route that we want to go. That brings us to that point of the humanity of the preborn. But before we dive into that, let's talk through a few other examples. So we see how that common ground analogy question worked for poverty. Let's walk through a few other examples. And I want to give you a moment to think about and maybe even write down how you would build common ground, analogy, and question around the pro abortion position that abortion should be allowed when a mother is very young, maybe in university or even in high school. Abortion should be allowed for them. How would you find first common ground, second build an analogy, and third ask that pivot question to come back to the humanity of the preborn? If it were me, I would start by building the common ground in this way. By empathizing and saying, I agree with you that it would be incredibly difficult for somebody in high school to care for a child, right? That's really, really difficult, not just because of the practical components of class and homework and all these other responsibilities that she probably has on her plate, but because maturity level, that she may not even be in a position to care for herself, let alone for a child. Empathizing with the situation, the analogy that I would build is this. Imagine that a woman in grade 10 became pregnant and she was going to school at a very, very contemporary school. Not only was her boyfriend supportive and her parents able to help out, but her school was one of the modern ones that actually had a daycare attached to the high school to care not only for the children of the teachers, but also if any student became pregnant, they'd be able to care for those children as well. There's several schools here in Calgary that have this opportunity available, making it very manageable for mothers to have children while in high school. Imagine that's her scenario, but then her parents transfer in their jobs and they leave a place like Calgary and they move to a very small town where the high school doesn't have any of those facilities. They don't have a daycare. The boyfriend is not in the picture anymore because he didn't move with her. And her parents are not able to provide child support because of the job transfer and because they themselves are getting their feet established. Would we ever say that woman in grade 11 with a 1-year-old child should be allowed to kill her child because she's not in a position to care for her child? Well, no. Brings us back to that pivot question. If we're not willing to kill the born child of a high school student because she's not able to care for that child, why are we willing to kill a preborn child? Because the mother may not be in a great position to care for that child. What's the difference? We can go through several more of these, but the same protocol often exists. Bodily autonomy, my body, my choice, is something that we hear chanted time and time again in different pro-life displays, events that have pro-abortion, whether it's counter-protesters or whether it's simply people posing a very deeply held opinion that my body, my choice. Let's not take the trap of contradiction. Let's not simply refute, but rather go through these three same steps. Take a moment and write down what you would say for common ground, analogy, and question. If it were me, I would start by empathizing again and saying, I agree that bodily autonomy is incredibly important. The autonomy not only to decide where we're going to go for dinner and what schools we're going to attend and what careers we're going to pursue, but what kind of relationships we're going to be in with the people around us. Bodily autonomy is incredibly important. My analogy would be this. Imagine that the mother of a born child used her body to harm her born child, whether it was because of her frustration and anger that was built up during work, whether it was because the gyms around her were closed due to renovations and she really wanted to continue her kickboxing routines. For whatever reason, she decides to use her body to harm her born child. Would she be allowed to do that? No. Pivot question again. If we're not allowed to use our bodies or make decisions about our bodies that will intentionally harm those around us, why is it okay to use our bodies or make decisions about our bodies that will harm preborn children? Make sense? Moving into examples that come up very, very frequently and often carry a very high degree of emotional baggage, we need to be extra intentional on the circumstance of sexual assault. As I mentioned earlier, I have spoken tragically with dozens, if not hundreds, of victims of sexual assault. This happens far too often in our society, and we cannot undermine the lived experience that so many people are coping with today. And so when somebody brings up the circumstance of, I think abortion should be allowed for victims of sexual assault, they never wanted to become pregnant in the first place, they don't want to be reminded of that traumatic experience. We, again, don't want to refute the scenario trying to suggest that the statistics indicate that this is a rare circumstance or somehow undermine their position for that. No. What we want to do is we want to build even more common ground than we otherwise would. And I want you to take a moment again, as we've done for each of these previous examples, take a moment to jot down what you would say for common ground, analogy, and question on this issue of sexual assault. As I just mentioned, we really want to make sure that that common ground is very clear in the mind of the person we're speaking to. We never want to be flippant about our common ground at all. And yet, especially in this very, very severe, very heart-wrenching circumstance of sexual assault and rape, we need to be very clear with the person that we're speaking with, whether they're a friend or a stranger, that we understand the horrors of this experience and we need to do more as a society. All right. And so what we want to say is something along the lines of, I agree that sexual assault is one of the most heinous crimes in our society. But I'm not going to stop there. I'm going to go on to say, and I would agree that we need to do even more to not only prevent this from happening in the first place through education and other safe walk programs, we need to do more to punish the guilty perpetrators of this terrible crime to the fullest extent of the law. But we also need to do more to support the victims of this violent and traumatic act. Not just material support, but also psychological, emotional, and spiritual support for those victims, regardless of whether they become pregnant or not. We really need to be able to convey the fact that this demands a response. And it's not pro-lifers who are saying, whatever, we don't care about the victim of sexual assault, we just care about the preborn child. No, if we don't care about the victim of sexual assault, it makes no sense to care about the child who is a result of that violent act. We need to empathize with the hardship of that scenario. We need to connect on that level. Building on that, though, we can move into that analogy. And we have to make a realistic analogy. And so, what I'll say is this: imagine a mother with a 2-year-old child living in a healthy relationship. Her husband tragically loses his job and becomes an alcoholic, starts abusing the mother and child. What are we going to do? Well, the first thing we're obviously going to do is get that mother and child out of that violent relationship. But once we've done that, would we ever suggest that that mother should be allowed to kill that 2-year-old child because they remind her of that traumatic relationship? Because she never wanted to have the child of an abusive partner. Well, no, obviously not. And so, if we're not willing to kill a born child because they constantly remind us of a traumatic relationship and because they're a child of abuse, why is it okay to kill a preborn child because they remind us of traumatic relationships? What we're saying time and again is that yes, we need to resolve this problem. However, we can't solve problems by killing people. Even the hardest, most complicated, most heart-wrenching scenarios, we cannot kill born humans to solve those terrible circumstances. And if we're not able to kill born children, why preborn children? What is the difference? The last one that I want to talk about is one, again, that we hear very frequently, but demands an extra step, and that is the life of the mother. We hear often, do you think that a mother who is told by her doctor that unless she does something, she's going to die, she has to sacrifice her life for the life of that child? And while there are a handful, I'm sure dozens, if not hundreds or thousands of cases where mothers have laid down their lives for the sake of their preborn child because they would do the exact same thing for their born child, I think that we need to, after we build the common ground that would be an incredibly difficult situation, as these other ones have been as well, incredibly overwhelming to be told by a doctor that your life is at risk. That your life is at risk, especially as connected to another human's life. That would be so overwhelming and so difficult to fathom and process. We want to, before we talk about an analogy, what we want to do is we want to offer a definition. What do we mean by abortion? When we're talking about abortion, we're not simply saying anything which results in the child dying, but only those things which intentionally and directly act on the body of the child to bring about their death. For clarity, let's use an example of a mother who is diagnosed with late-term cancer. If she's pregnant, we will hopefully be able to delay treatment until she can successfully deliver that child. Then we offer her the chemotherapy and radiation, and both survive. And yet, if that child is only 8 weeks old and we're not able to wait all the way until 20 or 22 weeks to be able to deliver that child, is chemotherapy and radiation an act that is going to save that mother's life potentially from cancer and abortion because it may have the tragic side effect of killing that child? I would argue no, because there's no intent to kill that child. The intent is to save the mother and it has a tragic side effect of killing that preborn child, and yet we're not trying to kill the child. It'd be very different if we decided that we were going to go in there, we're going to rip that child apart through a surgical abortion and then give her chemotherapy. Then the intent of the surgical abortion is to kill the child. Same thing would go if a mother who doesn't have cancer and is pregnant and wants to kill the child receives chemotherapy and radiation. Many of the medical abortions or chemical abortion pills are actually derivatives of cancer drugs, which do attack rapidly dividing cells. If a mother received cancer treatment, not because she wanted to be cured of cancer, but because she wanted to be so-called cured of pregnancy, and she wanted to kill her preborn child, then the intentions change. Then that action becomes immoral. Offering this definition clarifies this to a vast majority of mothers and people that we're going to talk to, in that we're not saying the mother cannot receive any support or help or medical intervention, only that she cannot receive medical intervention which is going to intentionally kill her child. And so that brings us through that first step of bridging the gap. We meet them where they're at, and we bring the conversation through that pivot question. If not a born child, why a preborn child? To a statement that should be music to our ears and not a very nerve-wracking or anxiety-inducing statement. We want people to go towards, well, but they're not human. Because what that does is that opens the conversation to the conversation about the humanity of the preborn. What it does is show that we need to talk about whether or not these human embryos, human fetuses, human zygotes even, are living members of the human family. And what we want to do here is we want to talk about what we call the human rights argument. These four incredible questions that can guide people towards understanding that not only are preborn children living members of the human species from the moment of realization, but also a philosophical understanding that as such, human rights must begin when the human's life begins. And so let's talk about that. The first question we want to ask is, do you believe all humans should get human rights? Thankfully, the vast majority of people that we speak with day after day do agree that all humans should get human rights, though sometimes we need to clarify, what do we mean by human rights? We mean most fundamentally the right to not be killed as an innocent human. Building on that, then, we want to ask the question, if something is growing, isn't it alive? If something's growing from 1 cell to 2 cells to 4 cells, it must be alive. Sure, there are living organisms that don't grow, but there aren't any growing organisms that aren't alive. If something is getting bigger, it is either through an internal force exhibiting growth or an external force that is building an inanimate object, buildings, cars, balloons, things like that that get bigger because there's an external force acting upon it. Whereas whether it's a plant, an animal, or a human, we are not grown by tacking arms and legs on the outside of us. We are grown through an internal force that integrates resources, oxygen, from the outside world internally. Internal force versus external force. Third question, then, building on that, is that if a living organism has human parents, isn't he or she a living human? This is very straightforward, knowing that when two humans reproduce, their offspring will never be a cat or a dog or any other organism. When humans reproduce, their offspring is human. When cats reproduce, their offspring are cats. Dogs reproduce, their offspring are dogs, so on and so forth. This can help people understand that we have a living human from the moment of fertilization. We demonstrate that life with the growth begins at fertilization, 1 cell to 2 cells to 4 cells. We have life from the moment of fertilization, and that life is life within the human species because of who the parents are. Finally, we ask the question, if abortion kills a living human, wouldn't that make it a human rights violation? This brings us full circle to that point, challenging the notion that abortion is somehow anything other than a human rights violation. And for a huge number of people, these 4 questions actually draw them all the way to the pro-life worldview. There are people who see these as the very common sense, very logical progression that they are, and realize, I've never thought about it that way. That is true, that those 4 questions lead me to the conclusion that abortion is a human rights violation. And yet, what if people challenge the notion of either the biology or the philosophy of this point? These 2 central questions, 2 and 3, are biologically oriented questions. Are they truly human? And if people take exception to them and suggest that they're too simple or they're not taking into account all the information that's available, we can do one of 2 things to help clarify. The first thing we can do is appeal to the experts, asking them who would have the definitive information on whether or not human life begins at fertilization. And thankfully, an overwhelming majority of people recognize that this question is best and ultimately only answered by the experts of that particular field, biologists and embryologists. This isn't to say that lawyers and politicians aren't experts. They're simply not experts in the field of biology. If we want a biological answer as to when human life begins, we go to the biologists. An overwhelming, nearly a universal agreement is found that human life begins at fertilization. This textbook is used at many of the medical schools here in Canada and many as well around the world. And on the first page of the first chapter, it clearly states that human development begins at fertilization, marking the beginning of each of us as a unique individual. This is something that you can find not only in post-secondary textbooks across Canada and around the world. Not simply Christian or Catholic universities, but secular universities all agree on this point. But you can often find this information at the high school level or even the middle school level as well. And so we can appeal to the experts. We can challenge people to pull out their smartphone and Google, when does human life begin? All of the objective sources that you're going to find, including the top one listed, will state human life begins at fertilization. But that's not the only way that we can respond. We can also challenge them to draw their life back to its very beginning. How far can you trace your life back to fertilization? As an adult, we accept that I didn't pop into existence as an adult. A few years ago, I was a teenager, but I didn't pop into existence as a teenager either. Before that, I was an adolescent. Before that, I was a toddler. Before that, I was an infant. And yet, we also know that storks don't deliver infants that just popped into existence either. We can trace that infant's life back to the fetal stage of development. Yet mothers don't wake up one morning and pop, there's an 8-month-old fetus within their womb. We can trace their lives back to the embryonic stage and back to the zygotic stage, that 1-cell human zygote. We can trace a unique genetic code and our independent behavior as individual organisms back to that moment of fertilization. But no further. We can't say that we were ever a human sperm cell or human egg cell, because whose genetic code was in that sperm cell or egg cell? The man and the woman's respectively. And yet whose genetic code is in that zygote? That new human's genetic code. Sure, it is made up of half the genetic code from the father and half from the mother, and yet the same could be said for any adult. Right? We have a new, unique genetic code, and we have a new behavior as an independent organism with all of the systems within that very small cell, all the way up to the adult stage, coordinated for the success and well-being of that new organism. So those are the 2 ways that we can help answer questions 2 and 3 regarding the humanity of the preborn. And that takes us through that humanity question. For many people, as I mentioned, this will draw them to an acceptance of the pro-life worldview. Though sometimes, to be fair, we do often go through several rounds of common ground analogy question as we navigate the several different circumstances that come to mind for people who support abortion. And yet, at times, we often, as we mentioned before, have to answer the question, sure, they're human, but are they really people? Sure, they're members of the species Homo sapien, but are they valuable human beings? Are they people like you and I? And that's where we get into conversations about personhood. These are answered by questions 1 and 4, the philosophical components of the human rights argument. These questions don't tell us what something is, but how we should respond to that information of what something is. Biology tells us what it is, philosophy tells us how we should respond to it. And so when we look at ourselves as adult humans, we acknowledge, thankfully, that adult humans should get human rights. And we, as pro lifers, and the people that we've now spoken to, now accept that these human beings, prior to birth, human embryos, human zygotes, human fetuses, are also living members of the human species. And yet, often, they will point towards differences that exist between born and preborn humans, whether it's the size of that human being, whether it's the fact that they are smaller than a dot on the page, or the fact that they don't look very much like a born human being, components that pivot around our size. We may also hear opposition about differences related to our level of development. Level of development being whether or not they're rational or conscious or self-aware, whether or not they have a heartbeat or brain waves or arms and legs or the ability to communicate. All these different levels of development that exist different between born and preborn humans. They could talk about difference in environment, the fact that during this 9 months or approximately 9 months of our life, we are living literally inside of another human being, a very unique environment, obviously. Or they might talk about the difference in dependency, the fact that these are human beings who are entirely dependent on their mothers. And what we don't want to do is to debate whether or not these differences exist. They very clearly do exist. And while we could talk about how they also exist between different born humans, how different born humans are different sizes and at different stages of development and in different environments and have different degrees of dependency on the people or objects around them. What we can do to hasten the progression of the debate, of the conversation that we're having, is simply ask the question, why? Why do these differences exist? And each and every one of them, the question of why is answered with age. Why is the preborn child smaller than an adult? Because of how old they are. Why don't they have a particular level of development? Why haven't they gone through puberty? Why don't they have a rational brain? Why aren't they self-aware? Because of how old they are. Why do they live within their mother's womb? Because of how old they are. Why are they entirely dependent on their mother? Because of how old they are. And so, what we're saying is that you don't get human rights based on the fact that you're human. It's not that human equals human rights. What we're saying is that human plus a particular attribute equals human rights. And that attribute is traced back to our age. You have to be human plus a particular age to get human rights. And so, for some people, they're willing to accept that until we put it in context, until we say human plus X equals human rights, human plus particular age. How is that any different or any better than saying human plus a particular ethnicity to get human rights, or human plus a particular gender to get human rights, or human plus a particular skin color to get human rights? We have used this formula of human plus X throughout history to discriminate human rights based on a wide array of different attributes, many of which are completely outside of the control of the victims of the injustices that stemmed from this discrimination. And when you put this in perspective, of the other forms of discrimination that have gone on throughout history, and many of which are still continuing today, it helps people realize that the human right to not be killed as an innocent person cannot be based on any arbitrary factor that we have no control over. The only thing that we share equally as members of the human family is that very fact: membership in the human family. Therefore, human rights must begin when the human's life begins, unless we're going to somehow justify killing weak and vulnerable humans. And it might seem callous to put this injustice beside other injustices which have caused so much pain, so much suffering throughout human history. And yet, if we consider the fact that human rights are guaranteed not for the strong and for the powerful, but for the weak and defenseless, we have to consider the fact that who is weaker and more defenseless than a preborn child? The only human pictured here that cannot defend themselves in any way, who cannot cry out for help, who cannot run to try to escape the attacker, is the preborn child. And that demands our attention, and that demands a, a society which recognizes that human rights are not earned. You don't need to pass a test of aptitude or capabilities to earn your human rights. You get human rights based on the fact that you're human, or else humans die. They have died throughout history because of discrimination, and they continue to die today because of age-based discrimination. And for many people, that answers the question of personhood. That draws them towards an understanding that no, to be consistent, to consistently understand that humans can't be killed to solve problems. All humans deserve human rights. The terms human and person must be synonymous, must be entirely interchangeable, unless I'm willing to go down the same road we have gone down before on countless occasions that has resulted in the mass slaughter of huge identifiable groups of human beings. And this is how our conversations often go when we're engaging on an intellectual level, primarily an intellectual level. And yet, for many people, we have to understand that abortion is so much more than just an intellectual issue. With 100,000 abortions being performed nearly every year in Canada, there are a tremendous number of mothers, fathers, siblings, cousins, and extended family, neighbors, and others within the community who have been directly impacted by the abortion issue. And that, understandably so, results in heart apologetics conversations where we navigate with them the experiences that they or their loved ones have experienced to help them understand that by being opposed to abortion, we are not hating or condemning people who have chosen abortion in their lives. What we're doing is trying to connect with them to show them first and foremost that we as pro-lifers are future focused. We are here to prevent future abortions. And tragically, a huge number of abortions are performed on mothers who have already had at least one abortion. And so we need to help convey to them that we want to protect those mothers, those fathers who have been involved in abortions in the past from being involved in abortions in the future. Whether they're their own abortions, whether they may have a second or third or fourth abortion, or whether it's the influence on other people around us. And we have to understand the influence that these people have had, whether they want to or not. Imagine you were going to take a trip to a country that you had never been to before. If you wanted advice on the best places to go, the best resorts, the best restaurants, the best cultural things to do, you would probably talk to somebody who had been there before. How much more so when a mother is contemplating abortion for their child, something that they surely don't want to do but may believe is necessary for them in their life circumstance? How much more are they going to seek out the advice, the counsel of somebody who has already had an abortion to ask them about their personal experience? This gives them an opportunity to be either a force for life or a force for abortion. Again, why we need to have meaningful interactions with those who have had abortions. But lastly, because we also want to bring about the hope and healing for those who have had abortions. We are not looking to the past in condemnation, but rather because we want to draw them towards hope and healing. And so when we talk about heart apologetics, when we encounter somebody with whom the intellectual or academic arguments may not be resonating very deeply, we may need to evaluate whether or not there may be a personal experience which is hindering their acceptance of the pro-life worldview. It may be that we're not articulating it very compellingly or very clearly, but it may also be that they have an emotional barrier and they're saying, if I accept that abortion kills an innocent human being, then I must also accept that my mother, my wife, my girlfriend, my sister is a murderer. killed her own child and I must condemn them as a terrible person. That's not what we're demanding at all. And the first thing that we need to do is we need to seek to understand. We need to convey to them that not only do we understand, as we have built through common ground, that mothers can be faced with incredibly daunting, incredibly challenging circumstances. We know that mothers don't want to have abortions. Nobody wakes up one day and says, hey, maybe I'll become pregnant today so that I can have an abortion 8 weeks from now. Nobody views this as a rite of passage, or very few at the very least. And so we need to demonstrate our understanding, and we need to seek to understand them so that we can understand what they have gone through and what challenges have been presented in their lives or the lives of the people that they love and care for. This doesn't mean asking them directly, oh, you seem really pro-choice. Have you had an abortion? That's a very personal question. What I'll often do is I will be very forthcoming in stating that I know people who have had abortions. I know people from high school. I know people from post-secondary. I know people from working in the pro-life movement who have had abortions. And I love them deeply. And I want the best for them. I want to say that proactively so that they can understand that I'm not condemning them or the person that they love. And I'm not demanding of them that they condemn the people around them who have had abortions. With that, we love them genuinely. I love the quote from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who said, whom you would change, you must first love, and they must know that you love them. That common ground helps demonstrate that love. But we need to go even further, especially when they reveal to us, as I have had on literally hundreds, if not thousands of occasions, people reveal to me, sometimes for the first time ever, that they themselves had an abortion. We need to articulate our deep love for them and our desire for the best for them, their healing, their recovery, their repentance. We want the best for them, and we want to help them navigate that emotional turmoil that they may or may not be facing. We can't assume that everyone who has had an abortion is an emotional basket case, or at least an explicit one who is coping with alcoholism or drug addiction or whatever. Sure, there are many who do struggle with these different addictions as coping mechanisms for that experience. And yet we need to be there for them, and we need them to lead their recovery. We need to empathize with them and walk with them together. And that is going to look different depending on who you are. If you have a personality, a disposition that is going to connect very emotionally, very clearly with them, then leverage that. Be who you are. For me, there have literally been times where I've said, I don't know the best thing to say to you, but I want you to know that I care. I want you to know that I don't hate you and that I love you and that I want the best for you. Saying it like that and saying like, I don't know what I need to say to you. For you to understand this, for you to understand that I want to help, but I just don't know how. I just don't know what you need. Help me understand. Help me care for you. Help me love you. To be able to convey our desire to do that is necessary, because in those words of Dr. King, it's not good enough to simply love the person that we want to change. They have to know that we love them. And lastly, that leads us towards inspiring them and offering a different perspective. For many people, they're unaware, especially in that high stress, high anxiety, seems like the world is crashing down around them moment of finding out that they're pregnant. They're not looking for options for how to navigate their challenging pregnancy. Maybe they've been told by their spouse, by their boyfriend, that they're going to be dumped and they're going to be out on the street. Maybe they've been told by their parents that they're going to get kicked out of the house if ever they come home pregnant. Maybe they've been told by their employer that they're going to get fired if they're not able to fulfill their duties. That can be terrifying. That can be incredibly overwhelming. And as we seek to understand, as we learn more about what they may have gone through, to be able to inspire them towards, if this were to happen again, how could somebody like me help you navigate those challenges in a way that result in something other than abortion? How can we include and involve the resources that we have available at our wonderful pregnancy care centers across the country? How can we leverage that support, that material support, psychological support, emotional support, spiritual support to help you navigate whatever hurdles may be in your place, and inspiring them to courageously make the decision in the future, and to help others courageously make the decision in the future to not choose abortion, to navigate their pregnancies in ways that are life affirming, acknowledging that abortion directly and intentionally kills a child. We have to remember that truth without love is ineffective. However, love without truth is a lie. We cannot be conveying the fact that, you know what, that was really terrible. I understand why you had the abortion. And if you were in that scenario again, it would make sense to have another abortion. That's not what true empathy, that's not what true love means. What true love means is acknowledging the hardship, entering into that hardship and working with them, loving them enough to help them have the courage to overcome the hurdles that are before them. That's what we want to do. That's the inspiration and invitation we want to offer to help them in the future, but also give them the tools to help the people around them, to support them, connect them with the, as I mentioned, the incredible resources that are already available, whether through a church, whether through a pregnancy care center, whether through your local pro-life group. That is how we can inspire people to make a different decision. And so that brings us to the conclusion. That brings us to how we draw people towards the pro-life worldview. We need to understand that this is a very large decision for people, that people don't come to support or reject abortion flippantly. And for some, they may need to percolate on this information for hours or days or even weeks because of the implications that a pro-life worldview may have in their life. Maybe it changes the way that they engage in sexual escapades of nightly hookups with members of their college community. Maybe it changes the way that they interact with the people around them and the relationships that they're in. We need to draw them towards that with that focus on the humanity after we've bridged the gap. We need to remember how to leverage that human plus X equation to help them understand that discrimination based on our age is no better than discrimination based on skin color, ethnicity, gender, or any other factor that we have discriminated on throughout history. And lastly, we need to be able to engage the heart and not just the head. We need to be able to inspire them, love them through understanding. We need to be able to connect them on a human level, help them understand that we're not here to condemn them and we're not asking them to condemn anyone else around them, but rather love them genuinely in a way that will help them and the people around them make different decisions in the future that are life affirming and not going to result in the intentional death of a child. And also connecting them possibly with post abortive healing ministries, whether Silent No More Awareness campaign, whether a local church ministry that helps people navigate the emotional aftermath of abortion, whatever it may be. These are the steps that we want to go through as we draw people towards an acceptance of the pro-life position. I'd love to answer any questions that you might have. You're welcome to send them along to me, ccote@endthekilling.ca. You can learn more about our podcast, learn more about the 201, 301, 401 levels of apologetics that can help you in the more difficult conversations that you're having by checking out our podcast at our website, www.prolifeguys.com. You can also check out our content on your favorite podcast catcher, the Pro-Life Guys podcast, or on YouTube as well. You can also check out our parent organization, the Canadian Centre for Bioethical Reform, at www.endthekilling.ca. Connect with us there. Find opportunities for you to have a mind-changing, life-saving, and culture-transforming impact in your world by applying these skills to the people around you, whether friends or family members, or even random strangers within your local community. Thanks so much, and hope you have a great rest of your day.